The emperor, on his return to France, had found the army reduced to less than 100,000 men. In 2 months, he had increased its force 5 times. A zealous and active administration had seconded Napoleon's efforts, and the nation, by its sympathy and by means of spontaneous gifts by levies of free troops, had proved its ardor for the defense of the soil of the fatherland. The emperor hesitated some time before deciding whether to remain on the defensive and to draw the enemy on either to Lyon or Paris, or whether, on the contrary, to take the offensive. He ended by deciding on the latter, after having armed and provisioned all the fortresses on our frontiers, having settled on a system of fortifications for the defense of Paris and Lyon, and having established supplementary gun factories and collected considerable quantities of ammunition of every kind. Napoleon left Paris on June 12th. At Avesnes, he decided the first operations of the army by an order of the day, which he wished to keep secret. On the 14th, General Bourmont, commanding a division of the 4th Corps, Clouet, colonel of the engineers, and Major Villoutre, staff officer, and formerly equerry to the emperor, followed by some officers, to the disgrace of French honor, passed over to the enemy and betrayed the order of the day of June 13th to them. In spite of this unqualifiable treachery, the campaign had opened under the happiest auspices for French arms. Napoleon had been able to hide his first movements from the eyes of the enemy and had succeeded in taking the Prussian and English armies by surprise. His skillful maneuvers, which had separated these two armies and brought about the victories of Ligny, gave one reason to hope that these successes would be followed by decisive victories. There was no doubt of this in Paris, and news from the army was being awaited with confident security when the report of a great disaster came to trouble every mind. Soon the defeat of Waterloo was a mystery to nobody. This fatal news spread consternation in our capital, and this consternation was raised to its highest pitch by the desolating reports which kept coming in spite of the faults committed during this short campaign, and notably on this fatal day, in spite of the slowness and want of decision with which orders for the execution of which the greatest speed was necessary had been carried out, in spite of the fact that Marshal Mortier's retreat had left the commander-in-chief of the Imperial Guard vacant. The Battle of Waterloo, which was won in the middle of the day, would have been a complete and decisive victory, but for the arrival on the field of battle of Bulow's Prussian Corps and Blucher's army in turn, and finally, without the absence of Marshal Grouchy's corps. A caprice of fortune upset the best laid plans and snatched from Napoleon's hands the triumph which was within his grasp. Wellington had even said to General Hill, who came to take his orders at the most critical moment of the battle, "I have no orders to give you. There's nothing left for us but to die here. Our retreat is even cut off behind us." Chance came to transform the vanquished into victors and success into defeat. It can be said that Napoleon and his soldiers fell gloriously. On no encounter of such importance did the French army display more heroism and more resolution than at the Battle of Waterloo. The young generals, the young colonels, the officers of the various corps were animated with the same ardor and the same enthusiasm. On the other hand, certain of the principal leaders of the army, demoralized by the recollection of the events of 1814, had lost that energy and confidence which often forces the hand of success. Treachery and desertion helped to transform our defeat finally into a rout. The French army, whose attitude and warlike qualities had been worthy of admiration up to the time of this catastrophe, retreated in fearful confusion. The emperor arrived at Charleroi and stopped there some hours. He sent out orders for rallying the army and made arrangements for checking the enemy's march. He then proceeded to Laon, where he established Marshal Soult in general headquarters and designed this place at the point where the various corps were to meet. After having received more satisfactory news from his brother Jerome, whom he had charged to rally the remnants of the army and to reduce this confusion to order, Napoleon hesitated some time as to whether he should remain in the midst of his troops or return to Paris. He decided that his presence would not be necessary to the army until his columns had been rallied, and that it was more important to return to Paris, from which, besides, he was not more than 30 leagues distant. The emperor accordingly returned to his capital, arriving there at 8 o'clock in the morning of June 21st. As soon as I heard of his return, I hastened to the Élysée. I found Napoleon there, overwhelmed with fatigue and care, and yet mastering the grief with which he was devoured. He was in a bath into which he had plunged himself on his arrival to promptly restore his exhausted strength. He had left the army in spite of pressing entreaties to the contrary, but he was not only a general, he was also the head of an empire. Napoleon had come to ask the Chambers for their help, with which he did not want to dispense, to check the onward march of the enemy, who were once more advancing upon Paris. But mad divisions, the conflict between Republican and Royalist passions, the ambitions of certain influential persons, a spirit of vertigo, in one word, were troubling every head in Paris, and there was soon nothing left for Napoleon but to abdicate for a second time. During the 2 hours which preceded and followed the emperor's second abdication, I saw him absorbed in cruel reflections and hesitations. His foresight of the fate which was reserved to France if he abdicated or if he remained in power, deprived of the assistance of the Chambers and reduced to a factious role, inspired him with 1,000 conflicting resolutions and the most painful anxiety. An apparent want of feeling rendered him indifferent to the devotion of his brothers, and to the remonstrances of certain faithful servants who urged him to adopt energetic resolutions. But the trial to which he had just submitted had opened Napoleon's eyes. He did not wish to add the horrors of a civil war to the evils resulting from a foreign invasion by provoking a redoubtable conflict between the Chambers and himself. He felt that his mission had come to an end, and that he could no longer recommence a career of prodigies. The times, the elements, the tendencies of men's minds were no longer the same. A close union of the great corporations of the state with himself could alone save France for a second time. This harmony of tendencies and will not existing in the circumstances in which the country found itself, Napoleon deemed that success was impossible. He might, no doubt, have appealed to the nation and to the army, whose feelings were not to be doubted, but he feared to raise internal dissensions amongst the French. The emperor accordingly preferred to resign his crown after having in vain endeavored to draw the Chambers out of their state of blindness, and not without having pointed out to them in the most vivid colors all the misfortunes which his abdication would entail. He addressed himself as the continuation of my story will show to ears that would not hear, for rest, at no matter what price, had become the first need of one and all. The intentions of a great part of the Chamber of Representatives may have been pure and patriotic, and yet the majority of its members only knew how to work with passion in breaking the sword and shield of France. It is painful to have to say that never was the nation represented by a political assembly more ignorant of its true interests, more below its mission, in presence of circumstances of such extraordinary gravity. Whilst numerous hostile armies were pressing in upon us at every side, the majority gave voice to none but vain tirades and untimely discussion on abstract constitutional theories. It was unable either to inspire the hearts of Frenchmen with a hatred for foreign domination and to proclaim the danger which was menacing the fatherland, or to rally itself to Napoleon's dictatorship. The only means which remained to triumph, perhaps, over a formidable league, after having provoked and obtained the abdication of the emperor, whom it feared more than the enemy, it at last understood the imminence of the danger and felt the necessity of seconding the ardor which animated the National Guard, the Federates, as well as the army. This assembly invariably inconsistent, not knowing what use to make of the power which it had snatched from Napoleon's hands with violence, and not daring to assume the weight of it itself, entrusted it to a government commission which was unable or unwilling to make use of it. This commission undertook to cool the national enthusiasm against our invaders. It decided upon the timid resolution to send 5 5 plenipotentiaries to demand the fulfillment of illusory promises which had been made by the Allies under circumstances which imposed a certain amount of prudence upon them. Anxious as to the issue of the struggle in which they had engaged, the Allies, at the commencement of the 1815 campaign, had declared their intention of respecting the independence of France and of preserving the integrity of her territory. It was easy to foresee what would be the value of our demands upon them, the day when these demands were no longer backed by arms. And so we had the grief of seeing the deputies of a great people, which so often had triumphed over these same enemies, present themselves as supplicants in the cabinets of the ministers and the camps of the generals of the coalition, and expose themselves to the humiliations and disdain of a victor intoxicated with his successes. I saw Fouché myself at the time, and he charged me to tell Napoleon that the plenipotentiaries had been instructed to demand that Napoleon II should be recognized, and in one word, to accept anything except the return of the Bourbon. Whilst these plenipotentiaries, furnished with illusory instructions, were making their way towards the headquarters of the Allied sovereigns, Fouché was sending confidence to Lord Wellington and to Prince Metternich to negotiate for the return of the Bourbon. It is here that we meet again with Mazarin, who is one of the secret agents employed by the Duc de Trento. Fouché, this former aide-de-camp to King Murat, has given curious particulars about the missions with which Fouché charged him to Lord Wellington. Captain Mazarin, who had witnessed in 1815 the exaltation of the French soldiers whose ranks he had passed through, and who had narrowly escaped being killed because they took him for a spy, was astonished at the facility with which Napoleon had abdicated when there remained to him, round Paris alone, a reorganized army of more than 80,000 men filled with fanatical enthusiasm for his person, shaking with indignation at the yoke which it was wished to lay upon them, and burning with an ardor which was proof against anything, and that at the very time when Mazarin had just seen that the Prussians and the English, on the contrary, were divided on the question of the reestablishment of Louis XVIII. We ourselves saw the Prussian cannon pointed against the Tuileries Palace. Monsieur Marshal Daru, the military intendant, had assured me that overtures had been made by Generals Guineasau to General Maison, at the time governor of Paris, to induce him to join with Field Marshal Blücher for the purpose of driving the Bourbons out and of proclaiming a Prussian prince King of France. General Maison, whilst asking for time to consider his answer, had come to the conclusion that it was better to keep Louis XVIII than to accept the Prussian yoke. The judicious reflections made by Joseph Bonaparte on the conduct of the French chambers during the last years of the empire will not, we think, be read without interest. One might say that these reflections had been written by Napoleon himself. They are as follows. One must not cast on the nation the blame which is deserved by the members of the Chamber of Deputies who, in 1813, joined themselves to Mr. Launay, whose opinions at the time may be judged by those which he has since professed for the Bourbon, nor by the opinions and conduct of the Chamber of 1815, presided over by Lanjuinais, an honest but short-sighted man, a bourgeois Cato, and the eternal dupe of intriguers of every color and every party. The French nation is no more in a coterie of peers than the Italian spirit is in the Sacred College and amongst the Neapolitan barons. The French nation is in the day laborer's workshop, in the middle-class family interior, in the workroom of the busy man, in the peasant's field, in the minds of all who palpitate at the remembrance of our national glory, in these old remains of so many heroes. The French nation is the nation which received Napoleon on his return from the island of Elba, which is conscious of what is right and what is wrong, which does not accuse the man whom she admires and whose widow she will long consider herself. This nation is not frivolous, capricious, changing, as people would have one believe. It feels today what it felt on the morrow of Austerlitz. But Europe has been pressing her down for the last 15 years, and though it has crushed its will, it has not yet killed it. In all nations, there are weak individuals who have been lifted by chance to eminent places. These individuals in decisive circumstances often decide the fate of nations by little personal passions, which, without suspecting it themselves, they are dominated. Unfortunately, there were many such individuals in the chambers of 1813 and 1815. And when they saw the precipice which they had opened beneath their feet, they could do nothing but groan and lament themselves. For France's misfortune, it was fated that men like Sieyès, Merlin, Carnot, Roederer, Boulay de la Meurthe, etc., were not in the majority of the chamber. The leaders of the majority were either men of bad faith or lacking in foresight of the future, guided by petty vanity, wishing to play the Romans of the time of Brennus or the Mirabeaus of the Jeu de Paume tennis game, at a time when they should have rallied themselves to the dictatorship of Camillus to expel the Bourbons, that is to say, the foreigners. I remember in this connection, to the eternal honor of Sieyès, that when he heard of the loss of the Battle of Waterloo, he came to see me, finding me in conversation with Lanjuinais, president of the Chamber of Deputies. He said to me, "If you want to persuade them with speeches, your work is cut out for you. Allow me to speak." Lanjuinais, he said, "Napoleon has at last lost a battle. He stands in need of us. He is coming. Let us go to his assistance so that he may drive the barbarians out. He alone can succeed in doing this with our help. After that, if he wants to become a despot, once the danger is past, we will unite to hang him, if that is considered indispensable. But today, let us march with him. That is the only hope we have of safety. Let us save him, that he may save us. The nation will be grateful to us for this, for he is today the man of the nation. France is full of people who think so. It would be unjust to judge the nation otherwise than by them, or by itself, by the forces of its resistance and the example it has given in so many important circumstances. Napoleon, without any doubt, desired France and Italy to enjoy all the happiness, all the liberty of which they were capable. Time, he used to say, will do the rest. Il tempo è un galantuomo. Suffice it for me to pacify them at home and to put them on the right road. The concordat, the empire, the imperial nobility, his marriage, all these things were maneuvers to attain an object ignored by the incorrigible, with their assistance by making everybody take part in bringing them to a successful issue. Mr. Colonel of the Fourth, he would sometimes say to me in jest, wheel to the right, to march to the left. Napoleon wished to attain peace with England, the conquest of all rights which the Revolution had proclaimed and which the Terror had exaggerated in 1793. To succeed in this, it was necessary to unite all parties, to make them all work towards a common object, which would have been the happiness of France, of Italy, of Europe, and at the same time an immense glory for himself. England successfully opposed this object, and Napoleon perished in the midst of his plan at a time when his real system and his real object were yet neither known nor unmasked. Napoleon had signed his abdication in spite of certain generous opposition. General Drouot groaned over the misfortune of two abdications in the same year. Carnot saw in it France's death warrant, whilst this illustrious citizen who had opposed Napoleon's elevation in 1804, dominated by the gravity of the situation in 1815 and foreseeing the sad consequences which would be entailed by the loss of a man whose military genius might still save the country, did all in his power to prevent his abdication. Lafayette urged it on with all his might. A comparison between the conduct of two men, known for their patriotic sentiments, who played an important part at this time and whose political opinions were opposed to the emperor, may, in our opinion, teach a useful lesson. Carnot was a sincere, straightforward man, eminently patriotic, easy to deceive, as are all upright and guileless men. He was Fouché's dupe. If his politics were not always clear-sighted, he understood, in 1815, all the harm that the politicians who dominated in the chamber were about to bring on France. I can still see him taking leave of the emperor, who was leaving the Élysée to go to La Malmaison. He halted on top of the stairs which led down into the garden, and there, this austere citizen, yielding to the excess of his emotion, threw himself on Napoleon's neck and leaned his head on his shoulder to hide the tears which were streaming from his eyes. Lafayette, a Republican of good faith, moved by a sincere love for his country, but unenlightened by experience, dreamed only of the means of realizing an impossible utopia. The state of France in 1815 seemed to him a favorable opportunity to enforce his theories. More ardent than ever, he raised a voice which was all the more powerful because it had not been heard for many years, and recalled remembrances dear to the nation. He made use of a popularity which admired, without investigating it, the strange phenomenon of a man who had perceived in the same principles for 25 years to break his tutelary sword in Napoleon's hand. The same regrets followed the not-so-different conduct of these two citizens. Carnot died in exile, deploring the blindness which had destroyed the only instrument of our safety. Lafayette was not long in recognizing the effects of the unfortunate influence which he had exercised on our destinies. I have in my hands a letter which is proof of this. It was forwarded to me by Monsieur de Lafayette himself, together with the following note written in his own handwriting. Lagrange, November 5th, 1825. I have the honor of saluting Monsieur le Baron de Méneval, and I make haste to send him a letter which I ought to have received at Washington, but which reaches me here through American hands. He will greatly oblige me by informing me that he has received it. I beg him to accept the assurance of the pleasure which I take in discharging this commission towards him. Signed, Lafayette. The letter which Monsieur de Lafayette sent me, dated September 8th, 1825, from Breezy Point near New York, contains these words which allude to the occurrences of 1815. My dear Méneval, Monsieur de Lafayette will hand you this letter. He came to see me twice and spoke to me at length on the source of the mortal error which has been so fatal to us. He deplores the situation of France and appears to me to be animated with the best intentions. Signed, Joseph, Count de Servilliers, Joseph Bonaparte. I have extracted the passage referring to Monsieur de Lafayette from King Joseph's letter. The rest only contains general reflections on the advantages of the American government and on the satisfaction which is derived from it, straightforward and honorable conduct. In the midst of the ovations with which the guest of the Americans, the friend and comrade in arms of Washington, was everywhere received, the remembrances of 1815 pursued him. Monsieur de Lafayette, during a journey in America and a short stay in this country, may have heard the words addressed by the venerable John Adams, former president of the United States, to a French general and a member of the provisional government of 1815, Baron Quinet, who had both taken refuge in America. Gentlemen, you did not understand the Emperor Napoleon. The abdication by which the Emperor proclaimed his son under the title of Napoleon II could not satisfy Fouché, who wanted a free field for the Bourbon. The Chambers appointed a provisional government commission, and Fouché, although he was distrusted by all parties, had a great influence in the selection of the 5 persons who composed it. These 5 commissioners were Fouché, Carnot, General Grenier of the Chamber of Deputies, Quinet, and Caulaincourt, members of the Chamber of Peers. Fouché naturally was elected president of this commission. He spoke to each and all in the language which best suited his listeners, but he above all endeavored to impress on everybody below his breath that Napoleon was an insurmountable obstacle in the way of peace. He found people of good faith in both chambers who were disposed to propagate his opinions openly, to listen to his insidious advice, and without knowing it, to second his secret designs. In adopting the order of the day proposed by Manuel, based on the fact that by his father's abdication alone, Napoleon II was emperor, the chambers had settled the question of the acknowledgement of Napoleon's son. The government commission, dominated by Fouché, did not think itself bound by this equivocal consecration of the usages of the old monarchy. It placed at its head its acts in the name of the French people, and Napoleon's name was omitted. Some isolated voices protested in vain against the submission. They found no echo. Amongst the members of the provisional government figured, as has been seen, Caulaincourt, Duc de Vicence, whose devotion to the emperor none could doubt. This faithful servant of Napoleon was fated to be called to play a last part in the denouement of the great imperial drama. After having raised himself with the emperor and having served him faithfully in good as in evil days, the emperor always had sympathy and esteem for Caulaincourt. This officer, the son of the Marquis de Caulaincourt and nephew of General Arville, both old friends of the Empress Josephine, was colonel of the 2nd Regiment of Carbineers when the First Consul attached him to his person in the capacity of aide-de-camp and afterwards employed him in various diplomatic missions. The very secondary part which Napoleon's orders and the passive obedience to which soldiers were subjected had given to Caulaincourt in the arrest of the Duc d'Enghien. This indirect participation, as we have already related, contributed to his fortune. Napoleon wished to compensate by all means in his power his aide-de-camp Caulaincourt for the attacks, as unjust as they were passionate, of which on this occasion he had been the victim on the part of the royalists. Accordingly, at the time of the formation of the imperial household, he was appointed Grand Equerry, and afterwards Duc de Vicence. As Grand Equerry, he established in the services which he depended from his post an order and a discipline which greatly pleased Napoleon. The emperor allowed his Grand Equerry sometimes to give orders contrary to his own injunctions. Whenever he recognized that the reason of these orders was in the interest of his service, the emperor liked to travel with extreme haste and would always have ridden his horses at a gallop. The Grand Equerry, on the other hand, wanted to spare them, and he was besides frightened of accidents which might occur by riding at too great a speed. Napoleon, in his impatience, often used to order that the speed of his carriages should be increased. Then one might see the Grand Equerry, whose carriage followed the sovereign's, leaning out of the window, ordering the equerries and postilions at the top of his voice to slacken the speed of their horses. Napoleon, who heard him countermanding his orders, did not seem satisfied with him, and perhaps in his heart of hearts thought he was perfectly in the right. During the negotiations which occupied the last period of the empire, the Duc de Vicence acquitted himself with a zeal which never failed him of the thankless mission with which Napoleon had charged him. Imbued with the principles of a purely military education, he was a strict observer of discipline, hard upon himself. During the retreat from Moscow, when there were 25 degrees of cold, he neglected to protect himself by wearing either a cap or a mantle. He only once wore a spencer lined with fur on which were embroidered the insignia of his rank, and which blended itself with his uniform. Vivacious and even rather brusque, with a habitually calm and serious expression, his manners were polite and often affectionate. His sentiments were chivalrous. He justified the opinion which Napoleon expressed about him when he said that he was an upright man and a man of heart. After the fall of the empire, the Duc de Vicence married Madame de Canisy, who had been married for the first time at the age of 15 to her cousin, Monsieur de Canessy. This lady's father, who would not admit that there was any family superior to the Canessys, had insisted upon this marriage. Mademoiselle de Canessy was still of an age when discernment and experience are wanting to make a choice, and her father had not taken into consideration the harmony of tastes and tempers, which renders marriages happy. This marriage accordingly did not present the conditions necessary for happiness, and so the two spouses were not long in separating. The husband was one of the emperor's equerries of the household. The wife was one of the Empress Josephine's ladies, and afterwards lady-in-waiting to the Empress Marie-Louise. The Duc de Vicence won over by the graces of Madame de Canessy, whose wit equaled her beauty, and who was one of the ornaments of the imperial court, had asked the emperor to consent to Madame de Canessy's divorce so that he might marry her. Napoleon, who had considered divorce necessary to society, had an instinctive repugnance to authorize it amongst the persons by whom he was surrounded and in whom he took a real interest. The quality of a divorced woman seemed a blot to him. Madame de Canessy, one of the Empress's ladies in waiting, enjoyed a well-deserved respect in his eyes. The Duchess de Vicence, in spite of all his friendship for the Duke, could not have retained her place as lady-in-waiting. Napoleon accordingly used his influence over General Caulaincourt to dissuade him from this marriage. It was only after the Second Restoration and before divorce was abolished that this marriage could be effected. Having accomplished his last painful sacrifice, the emperor, who was as great in his misfortune as at the time when he wore or distributed crowns, left the Élysée for La Malmaison, escaping the acclamations of an immense crowd which pressed itself every day in the Avenue de Marigny in the hopes of seeing him and saluting with his hand the Federates, who with loud shouts offered to follow his fortunes and to defend him. I continued to see Napoleon at La Malmaison, on that estate where the dawn of his greatness had shone, and which reminded him at once and the same time of things so sweet and so bitter. It was not without emotion that my eyes once more rested on this chateau, where, step by step, I had been able to follow the progress of his astonishing fortune. I had found him there invested with a power temporary at first, but already crowned with the halo of great personal glory, spending the summer in this charming retreat with his seductive wife, the most amiable, the best of women, and the personification of female graces, as he himself used to say. I had seen him there surrounded by his family and some faithful friends and servants, sharing in their games, seeking some relaxation from his labors in the cool shade of the garden, sowing the treasures of his fruitful imagination in conversations now serious, now humorous, but always full of original and profound remarks. I myself, at that time, humblest of guests, had sat down at his table. Soon the people's gratitude had raised him higher, and the procession which follows on greatness had grown larger behind him. He had been forced first of all to have a private table, next a court, but never had the exigencies of etiquette changed the kindness of his nature. When the venerable head of the Catholic Church had come to France to crown and consecrate the emperor, he had been received at La Malmaison with the filial deference which was due to him. Kings had come to this residence to pay homage to the great man as much as to the powerful sovereign. The rupture of a union formed by mutual affection and dissolved by the exigencies of politics had caused Napoleon to leave this place, which became the witness and the confidant of the regrets of a forsaken wife, and also the scene of a little court, the pomp of which often veiled the bitterest regrets. A premature death had snatched away the princess who adorned this abode, as though Josephine, to whom sovereign greatness had formerly been predicted, had accomplished her destiny and had no further part to play on this earth after she had lost her crown. Napoleon returned hither, fallen from his high estate, to take a last farewell of the tomb of his first wife. He was received here in his adversity by his adopted daughter, Queen Hortense, whose generous care and filial piety comforted him in his evil days. I saw there the noble courtiers of adversity, ready to run all the risks of their illustrious chief's bad fortune. The Duc de Rovigo, so energetic and so devoted, whose presence at Napoleon's side would have been so useful to him. General Bertrand and his wife, whose persevering loyalty only increased under adversity. Monsieur and Madame de Montholon, who were to give him in hard captivity the care of devoted children. Gourgaud, whose devotion bore the stamp of a chivalrous mind and an ardent imagination, the virtuous Las and his young son, whose adolescence formed in a great school was to bring forth excellent fruits. Marchand, whose noble master was to receive his touching services by calling him his friend. Walking one day with the emperor in the private guard which had joined his cabinet, he told me that he counted on me to follow him. I had no other intention. As I needed a little time to put my affairs in order, I asked him where I was to meet him. He told me that his first intention had been to go to America, but as there were some obstacles in the way of the realization of this plan, he intended to go and live in England, and added that he meant to insist on the rights which were enjoyed by every English citizen. As I expressed some surprise at this resolution, he exclaimed, "Without that condition, I shall put myself at the head of affairs again." My surprise increased on hearing this sudden revelation, and I could not help saying, "But sire, if such is your thought, do not wait until the time has passed. At some paces from here, devoted generals and a faithful army call for you. You are not a prisoner here, I suppose." "I have here," he answered, "a battalion of my guard who would arrest Becker if I said one word, and would ask as my escort young man," he added after a moment's silence, and with the gesture pulling my ear. "Such resolutions are not improvised." I then saw that the threat of placing himself at the head of affairs had only been torn from him by a flash of natural pride, and that it had never really been in his thoughts. This scene has remained engraved on my memory. At the end of this conversation, he told me that he wanted to remain at La Malmaison and bade me ask Queen Hortense to give me a room. I accordingly stayed to dinner, and I spent the evening with the Queen, preoccupied with the thought that I was expected in Paris. At 9 o'clock, I heard that the Emperor had retired to his apartments. One of my friends who had dined at La Malmaison and who had no carriage told me that he counted upon me to take him back to Paris. I told him what the Emperor had said to me, and he replied that I had no reason to fear that he would send for me before morning. This should not have been sufficient reason for my going away, because I knew that Napoleon often used to get up in the night. I very much wanted to return to Paris when I thought how anxious my wife and children would be at not seeing me come back to them. Absorbed as I was by these preoccupations, I did not reflect, a very simple reflection after all, that I could lend my carriage and send a letter to my people. I compounded with my irresistible desire to go home and waited another hour until I heard that the Emperor had gone to bed. I then yielded to the promise which was made to me by my friend that he would come and fetch me very early the next morning to take me back to La Malmaison. On leaving, I begged the Duc de Rovigo, who was remaining, to tell the Emperor that I should be back before the hour of his levee, and I set out for Paris. On the morrow, I waited for my companion of the previous night until 6 o'clock. Having no news of him, I sent to inquire as to the reason of this delay, and heard that he had started at 5 in the morning. I immediately set out for La Malmaison. But the barriers of Paris had just been closed when I presented myself, and I was told that nobody was allowed to go out. I returned at full speed to get this order countermanded as regarded myself. After a great deal of running about, I was just about to start off again for La Malmaison when I heard the news that Napoleon had just entered his carriage to go to Rochefort. Nothing had occurred the night before to make me suppose that his departure would be so sudden. I was painfully affected by this unexpected news, and my first apprehension was lest the Emperor had gone away with the idea that I was also abandoning him, and that I had repented of having promised to follow him wherever he might go. This thought tortured me for a long time, until Madame de Montholon, on her return to France, in 1819 or 1820, and later on in the emperor's faithful companions in exile freed me from my apprehension by assuring me that Napoleon had never once alluded to the circumstances which I have related, that he had never ceased to speak of me with kindness, and that he had praised my fidelity, assurances the confirmation of which I found in the souvenir which the emperor deigned to bequeath to me in his will. However this may be, I have always blamed myself for my want of presence of mind in this circumstance, and for my unpardonable weakness. I had separated myself from Napoleon, never to see him again here below. All my attempts to obtain an authorization to go and share his exile remained of no avail. I took recourse to the obliging intervention of General Wilson, who was the principal author of Count Lavallette's evasion, to reach the English Secretary of State for the Colonial Department. All that could be accorded to me, such was the answer vouchsafed, was permission to go to the Cape. Once there, I should have been forced to write to the governor of St. Helena to ask for permission to come to this island, Sir Hudson Lowe being entirely master to grant or refuse this permission. It was impossible for me to obtain any other answer than this disguised refusal. I heard afterwards that Napoleon, during the night which preceded his departure from La Malmaison, had thought of rendering a final service to the fatherland. In the rapidity of their march upon Paris, the Prussian and English armies, intoxicated with their successes and full of imprudent confidence, had separated at the gates of the capital. The Prussians had crossed the Seine, and it would have been possible to crush them before the English army was in a position to assist them. Napoleon was of opinion that so unfavorable position gave France a real chance to fight the enemies one by one, to drive them off, or at least to obtain, by inflicting defeat upon them, more favorable conditions of peace. He had accordingly proposed to the provisional government that he should assume the temporary command of the army, undertaking to resign after the victory. Fouché's perfidy and the mistrust of some members of the commission caused Napoleon's offer to be rejected. Not one of them dared assume this responsibility towards a chamber which feared Napoleon more than it feared the enemies. This proposal especially crossed Fouché's plans, for he had come to a secret understanding with the Allies. He was afraid lest Napoleon should win back an authority and a prestige which should restore the nation to energy. The understandings which the Allies had with Paris, thanks to Fouché's connivance, gave them a feeling of security which might have been fatal to them if the offers of the great captain had been accepted, and allowing for the unforeseen chances of the events of war. It was in any case a remedy in extremis, and in this desperate situation nothing stood in the way of an attempt in this direction. Whilst brazenly betraying the emperor and the national cause, Fouché hurried on Napoleon's departure under the pretext of caring for his personal safety, and really so as to rid himself of the vicinity of the great victim, whom he still feared. The emperor, in speaking of the Duc de Tronto, had said of him the evening before at La Malmaison, "I ought to have had him hanged." I leave that for the Bourbons to do. The Bourbons were to make a minister of this regicide. Thanks to Fouché's patriotism, the Prussians, certain of not being disturbed in their movements, had come up to the walls of Paris. Napoleon, by prolonging his stay at La Malmaison, ran the risk of being captured by them. The emperor's departure, which was urged on by the provisional government, took place on June 29th. On that day, Napoleon left his retreat at La Malmaison, never to return there again, accompanied by some faithful servants who followed him into exile. Such was the end of the most splendid, perhaps the most glorious reign of all those which history will have to register. It will be met, we consider, to interrupt this narrative for a moment to cast a glance at the various causes which prevented the consolidation of the great empire and entailed its fall. These causes are many. Amongst them must be placed in the front rank the hatred for the French Revolution implanted in the heart of the old European dynasties and next England's successful resistance of Napoleon's efforts to enfranchise the sea. Above these two primary causes floated the fear inspired in the foreign sovereigns by the superiority of the powerful, innovating, and regenerating genius devoted to the triumph of principles which were incompatible with the spirit of the old world monarchies. As auxiliaries to these implacable enmities were: number one, the condemnation of the Duc d'Enghien, a painful event, a fatal episode in Napoleon's reign, of which the enemies of our country, in our bad faith and their animosity, did not fail to take advantage in their campaign against France and her chief. Number two, the war in Spain, a disastrous enterprise which divided our forces and perhaps prevented Napoleon's definite triumph over the sovereigns of the coalition. Number three, the 1812 expedition against Russia, which was doomed to failure in consequence of the severity of an exceptional winter and whose deplorable issue had such fatal results. And finally, a fourth factor, a dissolvent, to which reference must be made, and the force of which must be admitted, was treachery at home. Treachery, timid and underground at first, but hardly in the end, and stalking abroad with uplifted head. Two men, or rather two evil genii, had attached themselves to Napoleon's fortunes. Everybody will know that I am referring to Fouché and Talleyrand. Talleyrand, the last representative of the Grand Seigneur of former times, supple, insinuating, prudent to excess, always master of himself, without any conscience, grown gray in political perfidies, and selling his influence to the enemy, surrounded his hidden intrigues with mystery. Fouché, the former fiery demagogue, who had exchanged the red cap for the ducal coronet. A foolhardy marplot who needed intrigue as he needed air to breathe. Falling into his own pitfalls, was less secret in his maneuvers. Napoleon despised him because of his political immorality, but made use of him because he was convinced, I do not know for what reason, that he was necessary to him. The emperor believed that the apostasy of the one and the regicide of the other guaranteed their fidelity. In dismissing the first from his counsels, he was unable to deprive him of the power for evil, which Talleyrand's influence abroad conferred upon him. In retaining the other, he was nurturing a serpent in his bosom. These two men were equally harmful to Napoleon, one by his retirement, the other by his constant presence in the councils of the crown. They were not men of transcendent intelligence, but they had vices and capacities which stood them instead with Napoleon. They might have been considered sufficiently guilty to have incurred a judicial sentence, but Napoleon, trusting in his force, thought the noise and scandal of a trial useless and even harmful. His pride would, moreover, have suffered by the public confession that ministers vested with his confidence had been bold enough to conceive the plan of turning against him the power which he had delegated to them. And besides, they had risen with him, and he could not forget their first services. The man who used to say that the statesman's heart should be in his head always felt his own heart in its right place, in spite of what he might say. It is especially against these two men that Napoleon pronounced an anathema when, on taking his last farewell of France, as the shores which he was never to see again faded from his sight, he cried out, "Farewell, thou land of heroes, farewell, thou dear France. A few traitors the less, and thou wouldst still be a great nation, the mistress of the world." The emperor had left La Malmaison and had gone to pass a night at Rambouillet. On July 3rd, he was at Rochefort, where his brother Joseph followed him. During the 12 days which Napoleon spent either in Rochefort or in the island of Aix, he was undecided what to do. Should he go to America or England? He received proposals from various French and foreign naval officers and from several generals who sent him messages. The blockade of the English cruisers and the declarations made by the captains in command of the vessels in this fleet barred the way to America. Of the various measures which were proposed to give the English cruisers the slip, some were declared impracticable, others were considered inadmissible. Napoleon was loath to be the direct cause of the loss of the ships and the crews who should sacrifice themselves entirely for him. He preferred to wait for the safe conducts which were to be sent from England. These safe conducts did not arrive, and on the other hand, assurances which he could not consider official were given him that he would be received in England with the respect to which he had a right. As he was assured that in any case he would have every facility in this country for proceeding to America, he decided to go on board the Bellerophon, the principal vessel of the English naval station. He sent on before him an autographed letter addressed to the Prince Regent of England and charged General Gourgaud to hand it to him in person. After having accomplished this act, the Emperor Napoleon surrendered with all the confidence of a mighty foe to British hospitality. The Bellerophon set sail for England the same day and dropped anchor at Plymouth. The moment for landing was being awaited on board this boat when on July 30th, 2 English commissioners came to notify the decision of the British ministry to Napoleon, by which he was to be transported to the island of St. Helena. I will not relate, a matter of common knowledge, how the emperor protested, nor the various incidents which marked this most painful epoch in his life, nor will I dwell on the manifestations of respect which he received from the English sailors and soldiers, nor on the curiosity which was excited by his presence near the English coast. I will content myself with putting on record the sentiments of universal sympathy of which Napoleon became the object in the midst of a crowd ever growing larger, packed in innumerable boats which had come to contemplate him. The Bellerophon not being in a state to undertake a long voyage, the emperor and a small number of his faithful servants, who were allowed to follow him, embarked on board the Northumberland, which set sail without delay to the place of exile, which has been immortalized by the greatness of soul with which Napoleon supported his adversity there, and by his death. The emperor spent 2 days of his captivity in the house of an honest Englishman, where he was compensated for the insufficiency and discomfort of this poor abode by the care and the respect which were lavished upon him by this excellent family. 2 months later, Napoleon went to live in the house at Longwood, where he began that long agony, which was to last 6 years and to end in the tomb. The triumvirate of Allied sovereigns left Vienna at the end of May. The generals in command of their armies had already preceded them on their road to France. A fortnight after the departure of the 2 emperors and of the King of Prussia, all the plenipotentiaries who had remained in Vienna, with the exception of the representatives of Spain, signed the Acts of Congress. The refusal of Spain was prompted by the objections raised by the former Queen of Etruria against secession to the former Empress of France, of the duchies of Parma and Piacenza, the paternal inheritance of the infant Don Carlos, this queen's son. A subsequent convention which settled the reversion of these states in favor of the infant on the death of Marie Louise ended this dispute. Amongst the illegalities and the arbitrary spoliations which were consecrated by the acts of the Vienna Congress figure the arrangements which deprived the son of the Duchess of Parma of his mother's inheritance. This famous Congress of Vienna, which should have been an honest Senate, assembled to found a new public law intended to assure the peace of Europe and to protect her from fresh commotions, was in reality nothing but an arena open to spoliations and oppressive ambitions. four great powers made use of the forces which the peoples had placed in the hands of these sovereigns to ignore the social interests of these peoples and the promise which they had given to ameliorate the condition of these masses. Sovereigns and their ministers had been interested only in enforcing dynastic prerogatives and in enlarging their territories at the expense of their weaker neighbors, and in the sole interest of ambition, bringing about antipathetic fusions, dismemberments, barterings, traffickings, without either consulting public interest or decency, and with a total indifference to vested rights. The consequence has been that these arbitrary decisions scattered the seed of discontent, the ferments of discord, and future wars broadcast over Europe, finally having shown so much indifference for the rights of morality and justice. These powers, on the instigation of the Emperor Alexander, did their best to hide under the mantle of religion their selfish and greedy policies. The sovereigns signed a mystic treaty called the Treaty of the Holy Alliance without the intermediary of their ministers, by which, adopting Jesus Christ as their model and their master, they undertook to take as a rule of their conduct the principles of justice, charity, and peace, which had been taught by the Savior, to allow themselves to be guided under all circumstances by principles which they had most certainly repudiated only too often in their acts. General Neipperg, covered with the laurels which he had gathered in his last campaign in Italy, had returned with fresh claims on the gratitude of the Austrian government to resume his role as supreme director of Marie Louise's sentiments and will. This princess remained another year in Austria before she went to take possession of her new states, although she was preceded there by an edict of the Austrian government, which imposed a war contribution of 3 millions to the benefit of Austria. These peoples, happy to be delivered from the scourge of a military occupation which had lasted more than 2 years, received Marie Louise like a second providence. She seemed to have been sent to put an end to their evils and to bring an era of prosperity back to them. The most powerful reason of the flattering reception which was accorded to Marie Louise by her new subjects was, it must be said, that she had been Napoleon's wife. In the solemn entry which she made into Parma, there appeared by her side, and in the front rank, Count Neipperg, who was then her chevalier d'honneur and the guardian of her authority. The task which I undertook has reached its end.